Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Today we're going to see when the Beatles decided to take a break from touring and do their own thing. The Beatles never had things perfect when they first started touring. That was around 1962, and they played in small venues and the sound was good. After they appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, things changed drastically and there were thousands of people who wanted to see the Beatles perform. That meant they were placed in large venues where their equipment wasn't up to par. According to Medium.com, in most cities, the only auditoriums physically capable of accommodating tens of thousands of fans were sports stadiums. Unfortunately, this created major sound problems as amplification technology was not yet ready to fill these vast spaces. In many cases, the distorted sound came through the stadium's PA system and was a sonic mess. It was also incapable of competing with the incessant screaming. On the stage, the Beatles had to rely on their tiny amplifiers, and they couldn't hear each other play, which had to be a nightmare, and poor Ringo had to watch the behinds of John, Paul, and George to try and figure out what the beat was. The Beatles were all self-conscious with their playing on the Ed Sullivan Show because they knew it wasn't as good as their performances in the Cavern Club. They didn't try to improve too much because they knew the screaming girls weren't there to hear their great musical playing. John didn't like to rehearse, and when Paul suggested that they do it, he said, "We're grown men." Lastly, they were concerned about security. John F. Kennedy had been assassinated, and later John Lennon made statements that angered people regarding his stating that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. All of these reasons were the cause of them quitting touring. So, what did the Beatles do when they had more time on their hands? We'll start with John Lennon. Well, John decided to try his hand at acting again. He decided to do the film How I Won the War. John got critical praise for his role as Private Gripweed, and the director told John he could do any role he wanted to, but John wasn't interested. It came too easily for him, so he despised it. It was during this time that John started to take LSD, and the visions he saw he put to music. And then he was also an author during this time. He wrote 2 books in his own right and a Spaniard in the works. And not only that, he also was pursued by print engravers and greeting card companies that wanted him to draw for them, and art galleries also wanted him to attend their shows. And during this time, when he could have spent precious time with his wife Cynthia and son Julian, he instead preferred to be in a small living room and lie on a small sofa. He would stay there for hours watching TV or half watching it, and he also would glance at books and papers and throw them to the side. He didn't really talk to Cynthia, and he ignored Julian. In the evening, he would go to his studio and play his instruments, and Cynthia knew she wouldn't see him again for the rest of the evening. The next day, Cynthia would have to keep the house quiet until John woke up. Then she would take a breakfast tray up to him. So Cynthia stayed the same as a person, and she was always hoping for the best. Next up, Paul. Well, not touring was hard for Paul. He always loved the attention he got from the fans, and he was also one of the Beatles who worked the hardest at being a Beatle. He decided to go on a long safari with his road manager, Mal Evans, to Africa. And when he got back, according to the book Shout, he decided to get more into the cultural things going on in London. He was enamored with his girlfriend Jane Asher, and he went to all her plays, and she gave him inspiration for his songs. He wrote the song Here, There, and Everywhere for her. During this time, Paul created theme music for the film The Family Way, and he also started to produce records. He did it for groups like Peter and Gordon, the Escorts, and for Cliff Bennett and the Rebel Rousers. And last up, Paul bought a house during this time. It was on Cavendish Avenue, St. John's Wood. One perk was that it was close to the EMI studio. He also got an old English sheepdoggy named Martha, and she romped around in the garden in the backyard. Okay, next up is George. George was a bit lost with his free time like Paul was. He was in the Beatles at the age of 15, and it was all he had known. The final year of touring, George began to hate being in the band. And in the studio, George Martin would be heavily patient with him, and John and Paul didn't really consider him an equal. He was lucky if he got one song on an album, and he felt like they considered him a kid tagging along. George felt he wasn't considered a serious musician being in the group. He married Patty Boyd in 1966, and she gave up her modeling job because George felt people might try to exploit him through her. George started to get into the sitar when filming the movie Help, and he bought his own sitar and started to play it like he would a guitar. It helped him in the studio to become distinctive, and the sound was used on the albums Rubber Soul and Revolver. In 1966, at a dinner party, George met Ravi Shankar, who was a sitar player, and not just a player, but a virtuoso, and Ravi offered to give George lessons. George went to India with his wife Patty for 2 months to learn the sitar, and he was also on a spiritual journey while he was there. When he returned home, he decided to dedicate himself on learning the sitar, just like he did when he was a boy, and his mom had helped him learn how to play. And during this time, he hardly touched his guitar outside the recording studio. He practiced day and night in an Indian smock, and he listened to lessons that Ravi had recorded for him. Just like John, George started to take LSD at this time, and he began to read all about yoga and meditation. The books promised a state, according to the book Shout, that he had so far found unattainable, the state of perfect pleasure, enlightenment, and peace. Last but not least, we had Ringo. And Ringo was the one that was most at peace during this time. He wanted to stay home with his wife Maureen and their new baby Zach. And they called the baby Zach because that is the name Ringo had wished to be called when he was a small boy. And he looked at his Sunny Heights estate, his cars, the Vassal Vega, the Land Rover, the Mini Cooper, and the house itself. He had white carpets, 6 TV sets, billiard table, and a one-armed bandit. According to the book Shout, he thought to himself, "What's the scruff like me doing with all this lot?" So in this small window of time, the Beatles got a chance to have a little bit of freedom. That freedom scared most of the group, but it also showed that they had the talent to do what they set their minds on, just as they had when they first started the band. Their determination got to the greatness that they would achieve with the Beatles, and in their solo endeavors, they found greatness also. So I hope everyone's enjoyed the video. If you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, that would be great. And I hope everybody's been having a good day. Tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.